I'm glad to be here and flattered that C-SPAN would ask me to represent what is a very talented creative community in Fayetteville. There's so much going on here, both at the university and in the community at large, and I'm gratified that the rest of the country will find out about that. I published Prisoners of Hope in 2016. It was a follow-up to my biography of Lyndon Johnson. It concerns the domestic program, the 1,000 pieces of legislation that Johnson and Congress passed between November of 1963 and 1968. Most people, well, Johnson has been getting much more attention than when I began writing the book. All the Way hadn't come out. So he's beginning to get his due, but compared to other reform presidents, Theodore Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt, he still is very much in the shadows. People usually remember two things about Lyndon Johnson: the Vietnam War, which is justly regarded as a disaster, and civil rights, which is generally regarded as a triumph. But there was so much more. There was, in addition to the 1964 Equal Accommodations Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, there was Medicaid, Medicare, the first federal aid to education legislation, the War on Poverty, community action, the first Clean Air and Clean Water legislation, the first Wilderness Acts. Public television and public radio were created by legislation passed as part of the Great Society. The Department of Transportation, the Immigration Act, which dramatically, which Bill Schwab writes extensively about, which reformed, modernized the immigration system in this country. Arguably, the Great Society, the legislative program that was enacted in the 1960s, was the most significant, or among the most significant in all of American history. Conservatives have denounced it. Liberals have tended to retreat from it a bit in the 80s and 90s, but it has dramatically changed American life. One of the reasons, there are a number of reasons that the program hasn't really gotten its due. There's Johnson himself. Most academics of my generation were part of the anti-war movement, and they've never forgiven Johnson for thrusting us more deeply in that quagmire. There is the all-powerful Camelot community tradition. The country, particularly the cultural establishment, still worships the Kennedys, and they still regard Johnson as a usurper, someone who came in and took credit for what John F. Kennedy really created. In looking at this program and looking at the Great Society, it's somewhat surprising that you have a reform program of this vigor in the 1960s, because the country was then relatively peaceful, relatively prosperous. The populist movement was a product of widespread resentment by workers and farmers against robber baron capitalists and Wall Street. The progressives were middle-class folks worried about being crushed by captains of industry and millions of illiterate immigrants. The New Deal was the product of the Great Depression, massive unemployment and suffering. So why and how did this reform program appear? How did it come to be? Well, there's a couple of obvious answers to that. The civil rights movement came to fruition, the modern civil rights movement came to fruition in the 50s and 60s. After the Montgomery bus boycott in 1954, the civil rights movement became a truly mass movement. Previously, it had been driven by elites, which used constitutional law to try to achieve non-discrimination and equality. But with King, the advent of King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the black churches became involved. And then young black college students through SNCC and CORE. And so you have a truly mass movement. The public opinion polls showed that there was a dramatic turnaround in white attitudes toward civil rights in the South after the Birmingham marches in 1963, which were widely televised. And so Johnson and his colleagues in Congress were able to capitalize on that sentiment, on that kind of took advantage of that window of opportunity. The Cold War played a role in 1957. Those of you who are of my generation will remember, others have read about the launching of Sputnik, when the Soviets put a payload into orbit, touching off a firestorm of controversy here, widespread denunciation of the Eisenhower administration, of academia, of the scientific community for falling behind in the global struggle with communism, touched off a wave of soul searching. And indeed, it was in reaction to that, in part, that Jack Kennedy rode into power. He and the Democrats promised a new frontier, promised to create a new national purpose, promised excellence in education and science. That certainly played a role, I think, in the reform movement that Johnson presided over. And then there was the revolt of the youth in the 1960s. Time magazine in 1960 predicted by the end of the decade that 1/4 of all Americans would be under 24 years of age. There were now most youths, working class and lower middle class youths in this country went about their business as usual, but other students, more active students in Berkeley started the free speech movement, conservative students, and then famously the Students for Nonviolent, Students for Democratic Society. The Port Huron statement in 1962 was a statement by this new activist left-leaning coalition of students and intellectuals. It was an attack on segregation, on Jim Crow. It was an attack on the military-industrial complex. It was an attack on liberal capitalism itself. And this youth, this energy, certainly provided some of the fuel that enabled the Great Society, these reforms of the Great Society to take place. There was also this was when America's so-called greatest generation had really reached were at the height of their power and influence. The generation that had survived the Depression and defeated the Axis powers. Many of them had grown bored with the complacency of the 1950s. And many of them embraced, if temporarily, the notion of a racially just society, a society in which there was equal opportunity for all. Then there was Johnson himself. The various programs and policies of the Great Society were germinating in his mind from the time he was a child. He was influenced by his grandfather and father, both of whom were populists. His mother was a liberal Baptist and a journalist. He was when he was influenced by, when he was a senior in college, he was a student taught at a community in South Texas. He was principal of an all-Spanish elementary school there and saw firsthand the blight of discrimination and segregation. And even though he was a senior in college, he became a champion in that community for social and economic justice. He went to Congress as a New Dealer. He was a disciple of Franklin Roosevelt and established a liberal record as a congressman from the district which included Austin, the most liberal area in the state. He acted primarily in a conservative manner when he was in the Senate, when he represented the state as a whole. But then after he became a president, quite suddenly after Jack Kennedy's assassination, suddenly he saw before him this opportunity to fulfill the reform dream, the dream of reformers that had been evolving throughout the 20th century. Now, Johnson, the idea behind the Great Society was to create not a society which featured equality of condition, but equality of opportunity. And in a sense, that was fundamentally conservative in that respect. What he wanted, he built on Franklin Roosevelt's idea of positive rights. Up to that time, up to Roosevelt's time, liberals had focused on limited government and negative rights: the right to free speech, the right to assembly, the right to worship what you wanted, to whatever God you wanted. Roosevelt talked about positive rights: the right of every American to a good job, the right of every American to a decent education, the right of every American to have his children experience decent health care. And that was really what drove the Great Society. Johnson and his colleagues, cohort supporters, wanted to expand what the definition of American citizenship meant to include these positive rights, but also he worked to extend full citizenship to people who had not yet experienced it, which included Hispanics, African Americans, poor people in Appalachia, in the South, people who were, for example, excluded from Social Security because they hadn't had a prior employment, those kinds of things. Johnson, after he overwhelmed Barry Goldwater in the election of 1964, had a conversation with Bill Moyers, who was one of his great confidants and proteges. And he said, Bill, we've got 22 months to enact our program. And he said, what are you talking about? You just won the biggest landslide in American history. And he said, believe me, we got 22 months to get what we wanted done. He said, there's the old conservative coalition, the alliance between Southern segregationist Democrats and conservative Republicans that had been blocking progressive legislation since 1944. He said, there may be some enthusiasm among whites for civil rights now, but there's going to be a backlash. And so we have a window of opportunity there. He said, too, that there is the calculus, the political calculus involved. We will, in the next 22 months, expend every dollar of political capital we have. And when that window's closed, it's closed. There were also other factors that he did not anticipate, some of which were were a product of the very reforms that were passed during the 1960s. Part of the war on poverty was something called the Community Action Program. This was the darling of the New Left, something that the Office of Economic Opportunity incorporated. It involved organizing poor people to participate in decisions about their economic and political welfare. And that sounded good to Johnson. He didn't see any harm in it. But what happened was that the OEO extended grants to create more than 1,000 nonprofits, which in Chicago and Detroit and Boston began demonstrating against local and state governments, many of which were in Democratic hands, which created a political firestorm, which threatened the political consensus that Johnson had created. One of the programs that the OAO funded was the National Welfare Rights Organization. Johnson had promised that that the Great Society would make taxpayers out of tax eaters, as he put it, take people off the welfare rolls. Well, the purpose of the National Welfare Rights Organization, which featured many lawyers, was to challenge restrictive regulations keeping people off the rolls. Their goal was to put as many people on the rolls as possible. And so that certainly undercut the Great Society as far as conservatives and moderates were concerned. By the late 1960s, the New Left had turned on the liberal establishment. The Great Society did not go as far and fast as they wanted, and they began to attack Johnson and the Great Society reformers on the left, from the left. There were attacks on the right as well. Johnson and Martin Luther King, Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King are Southerners. They knew about Jim Crow in the South. They knew about lynching, segregation in the South, and that was their focus. They were ignorant of the burgeoning civil rights movement in the North, a much different situation. In the northern cities, occupied by millions of African Americans, many of them who immigrated there immediately after the Second World War to take defense jobs, didn't experience legal discrimination. They could vote. There were not laws mandating separation. But still, they were the victim of informal discrimination, market forces, public policy, and prejudice. And so that millions of African Americans were isolated in inner cities, decaying inner cities. And what they saw was white Midwesterners and Northerners acting to bring social and economic justice to black Southerners while denying it to blacks who lived in their own community. And what you had was a series of increasingly destructive riots. The terrible Detroit riot occurred 5 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, something that Johnson simply could not comprehend. He, after consulting with King and other black leaders, tried to accelerate social and economic problems in the nation's ghettos. The violence only got worse and worse. This provided an opening for conservatives. Johnson had, in the '64 campaign, argued that the war on poverty was actually part of the war on crime. Juvenile delinquency and urban crime had become an issue during the Kennedy administration. And he argued that the war on poverty was a way to fight crime. As the urban rioting and disorder increased, conservatives seized on that and turned it around on Johnson. By 1966, they were arguing effectively that the war on poverty was facilitating violence in the cities. They equated nonviolent civil disobedience with burning and looting. They denounced the Warren Court for privileging the victims of crime rather than the criminals themselves. And they argued that the New Deal in and of itself was creating an entitlement community, fostering dependency, a lack of discipline and self-control. And so by 1966, the war on crime had become a war on the war on poverty. And then, of course, there was Vietnam, something that Johnson had sensed as a cloud on the horizon from the very beginning. It was one of the things he mentioned in his discussion with Moyers. He sensed that it was something that he was not going to be able to control. Initially, there was a consensus, and Johnson was driven by consensus politics. When he campaigned, he didn't attack individuals or groups like doctors or immigrants. He attacked abstractions like disease and poverty. Brilliant, I think. But and there was, in fact, a consensus that supported both the war in Vietnam. Many liberal Cold War warriors believed that there was a connection between our acting in Vietnam to save the non-white peoples of that region from scourges of communism and what the government was doing in the South to eliminate Jim Crow. but the urban rioting domestically, and then the blunders that the U.S. made in Vietnam, the free fire zones, the massive bombing, and our continued support of what was obviously a corrupt regime destroyed that consensus. So you got 1968, Johnson's abdication, Martin Luther King's assassination, Bobby Kennedy's assassination, and the Chicago Convention, and ultimately the election of Richard Nixon. But as I say in the book, the Great Society, the house that was the Great Society may have burned to the ground, but the foundation still remains. But I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that foundation is under assault right now, as it never has been before. As was the case with the conservatives after the New Deal. They denounced it rhetorically, but they didn't do anything substantively. During the Reagan administration, attacked virtually every aspect of the Great Society, but except for regulations, did not do anything about Medicare, Medicaid, federal education. But that situation has changed, I think. Well, thank you for your patience. I'll be glad to take questions if you have them.
I was wondering, I can't remember for some reason, John Kenneth Galbraith, did he play a role in the Johnson administration? Because I know he was a great New Dealer. I just don't remember anymore whether he was in the background or wherever in that. Well,
he was in the back. I love John Kenneth Galbraith because he wrote a blurb for the Fulbright book. But so I say, he was a prominent figure in the Kennedy administration. He was one of the Charles River intellectuals that formed the liberal base of Kennedy's constituency. He was ambassador to India. Johnson didn't have much to do with him, but because of his sort of close association with the Kennedys. But Galbraith was one of those people in '64 who told liberal intellectuals that they needed to forget their prejudice against Texas and against Johnson and focus on the ideals that he stood for. And so he played a significant role, I think, in winning over or solidifying Johnson's support with liberals in '64. I noticed that liberal's not a word that's used anymore, is it? Because even liberals have run away from that. We're now progressives, that's right.
Hi, Fayetteville's favorite son is J. William Fulbright, and I know he had a tense relationship at times with Johnson. Could you talk about their relationship?
Yeah, it was a conflicted relationship. Fulbright he wasn't intimate with the Kennedys. He wasn't a member of the Hickory Hill crowd or anything, but he really was an intellectual, Rhodes Scholar, Eastern establishment, and for him, Johnson was socially repugnant. He believed that he was a wheeler dealer. He came to change his view on that. But what Johnson came to believe was that, what Fulbright came to believe was that as the war in Vietnam progressed and we continued to support a reactionary regime in the name of freedom and democracy, that Johnson had sold out to the radical right in this country. And he was also angry that he wasn't named Secretary of State. So that fueled that controversy. But Johnson remarked after his speech saying he wasn't going to run, he was talking to some folks and he said, "You know, we really mishandled Fulbright on this. We could have kept him in the tent, and it was a mistake not to have done that." So Johnson also told me, George Bundy and Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk, that Vietnam was his fault and his fault alone. Something was absolutely wrong, but I thought it was sort of revealing about that.
You said that J. Edgar Hoover appealed to the worst in Lyndon Johnson. It's been written and many times repeated that Lady Bird Johnson appealed to the best. What was her role in helping him form some of these ideas that were a part of the Great Society?
Thanks, Steve. Her role, she wasn't involved in policy. Johnson was manic depressive. He knew it, and I mean, manic depressive. He would just work himself into an absolute frenzy, and he would suffer through long periods of depression. He wouldn't get out of bed. He became paranoid. During the convention fight in '64. When the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was challenging the regular party and causing so much stress, he sort of took to his bed and declared he was going to take his marbles and go home. Well, she was the counteraction. She was the counteract, the emotional support, the kind of gave him context and balance to appeal to his better nature, if you will. She has her story in her own right. I mean, she came to, her father and her folks in Alabama were hardline racists, tough people, and she had to experience her own epiphany in terms of civil rights, which she did. But it's an interesting relationship, tragic and emotionally fraught relationship, because of the daughter said they never saw Lady Bird cry. How many of you could say that about your mothers? She had too many calluses, I think. But I don't know. Don't you need fire breathers over there?
I wonder if you could comment on the level of bipartisanship that was required to achieve this society.
That's a great question. Absolutely.
Compared to the current climate and how the what they used to call the country club Republicans were involved.
Johnson was a consensus builder. He infuriated the Democratic National Committee because he wouldn't pay any attention to them, and he reached across the aisle. Given, I mean, look what he's dealing with politically. The Democratic Party is divided between northern and western moderates and liberals, and southern states' writers segregationists who were conservative on economics issues. That's his own party. Okay, so he's got to have substantial Republican support. I mean, as much as 40 to 50% for many of these 1,000 pieces of legislation. And so he crossed, Johnson's always, the Johnson treatment, where he's got these, and people think that either he's threatening them or he's going to take their bridge away from them. It's much cornier than that. Johnson was given this sort of patriotic address. Do you love your country? I know you can't vote for this particular issue if you're from South Carolina. If you can't vote for the Voting Rights Act, but by God, you can vote for federal education, or you can vote for Medicare. And he would, and during the height of the fight over the '64 Equal Accommodations Act, he had to have Everett Dirksen, and he said, F, you got to decide whether you are the party of Lincoln or not. It's time to put up or shut up. And, he got it done. So he had this, Johnson was a rough, raw person, but he had this kind of spiritual quality that he invoked the Almighty more than all other presidents combined, including Abraham Lincoln. He told a group of journalists one time that the 1940 Constitution of the United Methodist Church would serve as a fundamental document for any good republic, any healthy republic. He did take advantage of the fact that the other thing I mentioned, that there was a religious revival in this country between 45 and 65 of unprecedented dimensions. It was estimated in 1945 that probably 45% of Americans identified themselves with some form of church religion. By 1965, it was 65%. And so and if you look at particularly the civil rights movement, the clergy, Jewish, Catholic, all brands of Protestants really stepped up to the bat. Much different than today. Much different today. If you did a history comparing specific churches which spanned evangelical or Protestant or Pentecostal, or in some Baptists, although Johnson's mother was Southern Baptist, Bill Moyers was a Baptist. But if you look at their stance on social issues between that has and the transition that's taken place between 65 and now, it's absolutely astounding. Absolutely astounding. Now the Congress was so much a different animal then, because senators and representatives knew each other. They met on a day-to-day basis. They had a staff of maybe 3 or 4. Now, my understanding is that the lowliest congressman has a staff of 20. If he's on a committee, that committee has a staff of 20. These people don't interact with each other. Richard Russell, the arch segregationist, was talking to another senator in the Senate cafeteria, and he said, you know what, I'm going to donate $50,000 to Hubert Humphrey's reelection campaign. That's Hubert Humphrey, the mayor of Minneapolis, who championed the civil rights plank in the Democratic platform. He said, and Russell said, if this gets back to my people, it'll kill me. And his friend said, why are you doing it? He said, because he's good for the Senate. Humphrey's good for the Senate. He has integrity. He knows what we're about here, what the whole operation is about here. And why we've lost our way in that regard, is a long, torturous story. And I don't mean to preach at you, but the Republic really can't. Compromise has become a dirty word. Politics has become a dirty word. Compromise and politics are the essence of democracy, the very nutrients of Republican government. Without them, we're a dictatorship, fascist, communist, totalitarian. I mean, what's the alternative? So we've sort of turned our back on the very processes which make this country what it hoped to be, enable it to really try to achieve its promise. And how to get back to that, I don't know. The other thing about Johnson was he was a great exponent of the vote. He was talking to Whitney Young, black leader, and he said, you got to get your people out there in rural Alabama and Mississippi. You got to get those black leaders to get in their Cadillacs and get down there and drive those and get those people to the polls. And he said, and Whitney said, we'll do that, Mr. President. He said, but their prejudice is so strong among poor whites that it's not going to make any difference. And Johnson said, that's not right. He said, particularly if we get a society in which somebody has enough to eat, where it has a job, and can educate their kids, they're going to vote in their interest and in the general interest as well. Unfortunately, that turned out not to be the case, because now we have people who are actually voting against their own interests, which is, for me, again, I don't mean to preach it, but that's a troubling element. And politics now has transcended liberalism or conservatism. I don't know whether you heard Max Boot on NPR. Max Boot is a neoconservative. Again, he reviewed my book in the Wall Street Journal, so I think he's wonderful. But he's very conservative, and he said, "I don't have any home anymore. This party." What is supposedly the Republican Party now is nothing to do with traditional conservatism. Individual rights, immigration, Republican Party has traditionally been a champion of open border. Ronald Reagan, free trade, international initiatives and cooperation. And he said white supremacy is not a conservative value. And so he said, basically, David Brooks in the New York Times, a conservative, Well, my book is about liberalism, and I've got a very nice review in the Weekly Standard, which is William Crystal. He's an arch conservative. So it's about these people are concerned with it. They have different views of human nature. They have different views of how to create a free, open, and prosperous society. And there's nothing in that debate. In that debate is where we have lived throughout most of our history. That's not what the debate's about anymore. So, but do you have another question? I need to stop preaching to you.
Well, since you opened
My
the
friend
door
John.
on talking about current politics as it relates to this, how would you speak to the role of the press that Johnson had, how it operated there, as opposed to what we see today?
Well, Johnson had a terrible relationship with the press. He didn't understand what the free press was. His view his view was grew out of the Texas relationship between Texas politicians and Texas newspapers and broadcast media, although broadcast media wasn't. And it was, you do me this favor and I'll do you that favor. You know, it was, and he wanted to have that relationship with the New York Times and the Washington Post, and it didn't. So he had and he could have had a very good relationship with the press. But the press now is different. That's not true. I think that the old core of the media that existed then still exists, but it's been overlain with new outlets, which are now, for example, now I don't know why anybody should be surprised about Fox News, because it's owned by Rupert Murdoch, and Murdoch, if I'm not mistaken, is an Australian, is he not? Well, in Great Britain, in the British Empire, traditionally, objective journalism is regarded as ridiculous. You talk about what kind of the duty of a paper or an outlet is to take an ideological and policy position and drive that position. And so, in that sense, Fox News would be at home. I mean, in that kind of tradition. But the key is you've got to have some counter. You've got to have some counterweight to that. But the other thing that I don't know, there was a journalist who wrote about the sort of pornography of the press obsessed with superficiality, with their refusal to privilege fundamental issues and fundamental questions at the expense of gossip and name calling. But I'm an historian. I only know about the past. I don't know anything about the future. But it is a time. Now you could people, and I have to address with my students, and I have to be very careful about addressing this because they got their lives to live. What difference does it make? But they've got their lives to live, and so, one of the ways to look at it is we're just on the cusp of change, and change creates a great deal of backwash. Many people feel threatened by change, and change is accelerating, and so it may be that we're on the, if you know anything about chaos theory, you have these periods of chaos, and then a new order comes out of it. And so that may be what we're experiencing. And it for our kids, maybe they'll look back in 20 years and say, well, gosh, that was the beginning of a new era. I hope that's so. I think it is. Having said I don't make predictions, but but I do. I mean, this country, the people created the basic fundamental institutions in this country were pretty amazing. And the institutions are pretty amazing.
It's occurred to me that coming out of World War II, a lot of the people that were in Congress were veterans of that conflict, and there may have been a greater sense of idealism and obligation toward making democracy work. And on that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's a point I was supposed to make and I didn't. World War II was the good war. There was good and evil. That's a little oversimplification, but more or less. And moral boundaries were clear. The World War II greatly enhanced Franklin Roosevelt's moral authority and his reputation. And his domestic reform program was wrapped in that moral authority, its legacy benefited from that moral authority. The Vietnam War diminished Lyndon Johnson's moral authority and actually has, instead of enhancing the reputation and influence of his domestic program and his philosophy, it undercut it and damaged it. So I'm not sure that's the answer to your question. That's sort of the answer I wanted to give. I think that I'm not sure people are less idealistic now. I certainly don't see it in my students. Johnson used to say, most people want to do good. That's not the issue. The issue is distinguishing what's good and what's bad, and that's not always clear. One of the things I talk about in the book is in the sort of paradox of reform. Part of the well, let me go back and just you've spared me 5 minutes on this because I meant it's significant. The thrust of the Great Society programs were non-discrimination and equality of opportunity. By 1965, various groups were telling Mr. Johnson that was not enough, that poor whites, African Americans, Hispanics had started the race too late. They had too many handicaps. And so he delivered a famous speech at Howard University in 1965, which he coined the term affirmative action. But he said, we've got some people are starting a 100-yard race some people are starting a 100-yard race at the 50-yard line, and others are starting at the 100-yard line, to use his analogy. So it was the birth of affirmative. He meant by that soft affirmative action, commitment to non-discriminate by federal agencies, programs, and by businesses. But affirmative action came to have a life of its own. And by the end of the 1960s, there were those who were arguing for hiring quotas, arguing that the ethnic and gender makeup of workforce ought to reflect the makeup of the community in which it resided. And so you had hard. This created another problem, a dynamic, because the women's movement in this country, the civil rights movement in this country, was based historically on an equity value, treating everyone the same, treating everyone equally. And so when so-called hard affirmative action came around, it created a terrific dilemma. Obviously, the whole idea of affirmative action was anathema to conservatives, but it also conflicted liberals as well. So, and all of these issues it's interesting, today these issues, Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid to education, voting rights, all of these issues are on the table again, are on the board again. Again, that seems to me an indication that they were undergoing a chaos before order. Hopefully, we're re-examining these values. Hopefully, at least from my point of view, the values will survive.